us into the real topic for today, and that's this question of hierarchy. Because I think Yun has done a lot of work on this. Maybe we can talk a bit about that, but probably one of the most important hierarchies that's come out of the last 30 years of politics is the notion that there are Arctic states and non-Arctic states. It's a very important division between that it is geographical proximity that has the most relevance for defining who should have a say about Arctic politics rather than what you can contribute or a global argument or something like that. So that's a very important basic hierarchy. But within that hierarchy, which we can consider kind of a club status for the Arctic states themselves, what I've tried to do in the book is get a sense of what are the different roles that are played by different states over time. And I think one point that's relevant for the seminar and also kind of relevant for this moment in politics is the importance of great powers in pushing Arctic politics forward at key junctures and opening up new areas for cooperation. When I say great powers in this context, I'm thinking about regional great powers like the US and Russia as kind of a regional major actor. And so what I've noted in the book is that in kind of the daily ebb and flow of Arctic diplomacy, they act very much like any other state actor. You know, could be Iceland or Finland or Norway in kind of Arctic Council settings. But what you see in kind of the broader picture is at agenda-setting junctures, like should we set up the Arctic Council? Should we open up the Arctic for kind of this type of cooperation? That the participation of these major powers has been very important. That's why it's worth, of course, Russia is also the largest Arctic state geographically, but it also has this kind of different role in the development of Arctic multilateralism. So that's what we'll turn to now, is looking at Russia as this regional power, shaping the norms of Arctic governance and how that has played out. So the first point we'll kind of dig into is trying to take a very briefly closer look at Russia's Arctic. Because if there's one thing about Arctic politics that is important to understand is that we kind of say Arctic as if it were one place, when in reality, even in simple geographical reality, they're very different places. Like, for example, my first experience in the Arctic was as a PhD student doing fieldwork in Nunavut in Canada. And of course, you know, it was the first time I'd been somewhere where I was like, there's nowhere to drive to. You can drive in the town, but you couldn't. And that, for me, as a Midwesterner, was a big shock and kind of that moment. But then when I first moved and started working in Norway, I was kind of amazed at my first visit to the northern parts of Norway because it was so interconnected. The climate is much calmer. It's not, you know, you don't have ice-choked waters. It's just a very, very different Arctic. So for kind of Russia's own Arctic, I think there are four kind of pendulum trends that are interesting to follow. And that's the first is just the sense of open versus closed. Marlene has written about this in her book, and I think in a very well-put way, saying it's kind of a security first or openness and cooperation first approach. And I mean, for those of you familiar with the Russian Arctic, you know that some of these, you know, major cities in the Arctic were some of the most like closed environments that we can think of. You had to have, you know, special permission to come in and out and so on. But at the same time, many of the resources historically and today that are, you know, productive in bringing wealth to Russia via the Arctic are, of course, part of global commodity markets. You know, Russia it's very clear that for their potential offshore oil and gas development that they do need external capital and expertise and so on. So it's this kind of balancing act between seeing the Arctic as more of a closed, securitized space and a very open space. And perhaps an example of that is, you know, in the 90s that there were cooperation on so many different areas. It included even, for example, working directly with Norway, the UK, and the US, I believe, working directly with the Northern Fleet on mitigating radioactive waste. So that's very tightly close up to kind of a military issue. But you know, the window for that kind of cooperation is very much closed today. And now Russia participates less in the Arctic Council, less as an object of kind of other countries' projects or assistance, and more simply just a regular state and not interested in those sorts of interventions in their territory. A second trend is, of course, centralized and decentralized. Also the 90s, you might have remembered kind of, you know, the parade of nationalities and all the sovereignty these regions could take was taken. And you saw in Arctic politics that many of the regions did play important roles. But of course now the atmosphere, you know, the environment within Russia is much more centralized, with key decisions about the Arctic being made in Moscow rather than Magadan or Murmansk. The third is, of course, a challenge that I think faced by many Arctic states, and that there's a strong sense of the Arctic environment is special. This idea, should it be conserved as kind of a treasure box of biodiversity or of unique environments, versus the notion of it being an actual treasure box of resources and real money, both mostly for the states at large, but also for the communities themselves. So you also see many of the Arctic states are sort of different places on that spectrum. And for Russia, their approach to Arctic cooperation has always been more about the Arctic as a source of wealth, but also a real interest also in the Arctic environment. So at the same time, as you see an interest in developing new offshore fields, you also see an interest in establishing new areas that are zoned as park areas and so on. And finally, and perhaps most important if we kind of turn to Russia's relations with other countries today, is this question of how Russia has big aspirations for how to develop the Arctic. And all of these aspirations require lots and lots of money. And right now, Russia is also like all countries, even perhaps exacerbated by the costs of, the Crimea and interventions in Ukraine, that will they be able to support and fund, for example, the infrastructure needed for offshore oil and gas development or offshore or for the Northern Sea route. And this kind of harkens back to a very important issue for Russia, is that the Soviet Union was, of course, a closed economy, and the Arctic was very heavily subsidized within this kind of closed economy. And then what the 1990s saw is that it was very difficult to maintain the same level of infrastructure and services in a market environment. And very much where Russia has kind of landed in the 2000s, 2010s, was that whatever happens in the Arctic needs to work by some kind of market logic. But that leaves the question of who is the first mover, who makes these initial investments. And what you see is a lot of emphasis on kind of public-private partnership, which is maybe between the Russian state or also these semi-public or semi-private companies, and also the question of external financing, such as with partners or banking, such as Chinese investments for some of the oil fields. So that's really the last kind of tension, and what you see, I'd say, over the last 30 years is sort of a back and forth pendulum movement between on these various vectors. So now turning to Russia's role in the Arctic Council as an example of kind of this Arctic diplomacy. To me, it was very interesting when I was doing the archival research for this book. It was very interesting to go back and go through these Arctic Council minutes and revisit some older interviews, because you saw that actually the Russian representatives were there and they were making suggestions, but these were often falling on kind of deaf ears. They were actually rejected or overlooked by the other states that were there. And I think it's interesting to be reminded of that. For example, one is Russia really sought for a long time to direct attention towards urban problems in the Arctic, which was a challenge because Russia really was at the time really the only urban Arctic. It had the biggest cities and the most kind of largest population concentrated in cities. So kind of GW's project on the urban Russian Arctic was really prescient. And for example, another would be that Russia proposed satellite cooperation tied to the Russian Federal Space Program. But none of those ideas were picked up on by the other Arctic states who were present. And since going ahead in Arctic Council projects requires the support of 2 or 3 or more countries, kind of some level of consensus, these simply were overlooked. And kind of the other main challenge is that often, this is more based on interviews about that period of time, that there would be kind of a disjuncture between the policy networks I mentioned earlier and the actual state representatives or implementation at home. So many kind of interviewees from other Arctic states, not Russia, noted that they thought it seemed as if the expert representatives who were sent to work on these kind of low political issues in the Arctic Council had a difficult time pushing the agenda in Moscow and actually securing backing for their activities. And perhaps what's most telling is that throughout this first decade of the Arctic Council, what you really saw was Russian representatives and senior Arctic officials repeatedly asking for more binding agreements. And all of the other countries basically saying, that is a whole nother kind of can of worms. We're not going so much work to develop these treaties. We can simply have it as a soft law. We can agree. We can implement it that way. So that's why it's so fascinating to kind of turn to the second decade of Arctic diplomacy, which is really marked by the conclusion of binding agreements where Russia chaired, alongside the US and Norway in 2 of them, and the United States in a 3rd. But essentially, kind of what I want you to my conclusions about this period of what I think was interesting and important is that this is the period where it was, what I mentioned earlier, this kind of collation of how Arctic states talked about the Arctic. There is, they talk about the Arctic being open, being a source of opportunity, but also being a source of various soft security risks relating to traffic and having environmental issues relating to an increasingly open Arctic. So Russia was very much involved and supportive of the Ilulissat Declaration from 2008, which some of you might remember as this kind of diplomatic display, saying that Arctic states saying that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is sufficient as a basis of governance, and that the Arctic states could manage any other governance challenges between themselves. And this was at a key point in which there were kind of rumblings in the European Parliament and elsewhere saying, well, maybe the Arctic should be governed not only by states, but by a regime like we have for Antarctica. So this was really the Arctic states, along with Russia, kind of answering and saying that kind of multilateral global regime is not necessary. Secondly, what was interesting to see is also that on the whole, most ideas that Russia brought to the table in the Arctic Council were now positively received. And this was not necessarily because the document, from my perspective, that the documentation was more thorough or more timely, but simply perhaps also had to do with Russia's changing stature on the global stage, that this kind of expectation that Russia was in transition and Russia was going to be something more like a European power had largely been given up. And it was clear that from 2007 in Putin's Moscow speech that this was kind of a country that was going to engage in major power politics. So, for example, it was interesting to see how, the previous 2 ideas that I mentioned, there were many more of them, were kind of ignored in the previous decade, but even Russia made some very good proposals, but also ideas that were very different from what other countries were proposing. For example, a National Geographic style magazine about the Arctic that was only going to be for Russia and written in Russian got this kind of resounding support from the other Arctic countries. It was no more relevant or irrelevant than before, but it was simply a different reflection of a different kind of power geometry there. And also that this is the phase of binding agreements, which I think is also a demonstration both of kind of a maturity in Arctic cooperation that perhaps had come with the second decade, but also very much a reflection of what Russia's preferences during the first decade had largely been about. And if you go in the early days of all of these binding agreements, there was no assumption that it had to be a binding agreement. Many countries would have been easily satisfied by kind of a soft law or some sort of shared policy statement on the issue. But there were a few countries that really pushed for that. And then, of course, there's this question of how does this all play out after Ukraine, which is, of course, a kind of very important moment in Russia's relations to the West and to Europe. And it was interesting to if we take a small trip in space and time to the first ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council after the annexation of Crimea, that they were gathered in Iqaluit in northern Canada. And to look at some of my interviewees have shared that it was a bit unusual because everyone who was there read their statements, which often sometimes it might just be, they might improvise a little more, cut corners, or just be a little more spontaneous. But it wasn't an atmosphere where those who were representing their countries actually stuck to the text. What was interesting is that all of those, either the countries did not mention Ukraine at all, or the worsened geopolitical relationship, or they went for a very the Arctic has to be protected from geopolitical tensions. And I think what was interesting for me there is that Russia made the statement was very much along those lines, saying this is a worsened relationship period between East and West, but we shouldn't let that affect the Arctic. But also the permanent participants, the Indigenous peoples representatives who were there, were very important in underlining the fact that there were these circumpolar interests that would be poorly served by a worsened cooperation climate in the Arctic. So I think what's important there as an example is just to keep in mind that often it's sort of an academic debate. Is the Arctic really exceptional or isn't it? But what's interesting is to see that that there are many states and actors that are incentivized to treat the Arctic as such. So that's sort of what maintains that kind of space for diplomacy and interaction. And this is just a quick graph. It's actually showing which countries had coordinating roles on Arctic Council projects in this brief time period. And you have to take, there's a bit of a grain of salt with this, because every time a country had a coordinating role, they got a point. And it could be that there might be 3 countries listed, and it's really the first country that's doing the bulk of the financing and the bulk of the work. And also, this was the same time as United States chairmanship, so it's important to keep in mind that is usually, when you chair the Arctic Council, you have more Arctic Council projects. But I thought it was interesting to see that, Russia really was, compared to some other international fields of global governance, like climate change or something, Russia really was making a contribution there at the time. And I think also what I'd like you to note is the sort of outsized role of the coastal states themselves in Arctic Council cooperation, which I think is an interesting question and something that could merit further research. So just to wrap up on some concluding thoughts, I think it's important to keep in mind that, Russia is well served by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're likely, I have a colleague in Denmark who made the statement like the likelihood of ending up with more Arctic than you might want in the end is it's highly probable for really all of the countries still making claims. And so there are many incentives to maintain this kind of zoned policy. And that doesn't mean that the peaceful frame of the Arctic is some kind of feel-good policy, but it is about an understanding, I would argue, in Moscow, that the country is better served on the whole economically and in terms of security politics through a low-tension approach. Secondly is just to keep in mind this kind of cooperation in conflict. And I actually think that some of our recollections about the history of Arctic cooperation over the past 30 years have been a bit, of course, we forget certain things. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the cooperation produced in the Arctic is not just a product of easier days. It actually is the product of time periods that were also marked by security rivalries and enduring distrust. Sort of 3 questions to wrap up. I think one of the things that I think is the biggest potential for disruption in the Arctic environment is not the militarization of Arctic problems, but simply the much more active and open Arctic increases the risk of accidents and incidents. And in this period of general distrust between Russia and NATO countries and other Arctic states, how would that kind of incident be handled? Would we have the connections to both mitigate and research exactly what has happened? And another interesting point that I think is quite interesting is that Russia for a long time has been very supportive of smaller multilateralism. So, the Arctic 8 is perfect. Arctic 5, maybe even better, the kind of coastal states. And so it's interesting for me in light of, also China's more active role in the Arctic and also the worsened relationship between Russia and Western sources of funding is how will Russia manage this preference for Arctic clubs versus kind of the opportunity and necessity of working more closely with China for some of their economic development projects. And finally, of course, is simply the question of dimensioning, that we know that the Arctic is actually undergoing very rapid change. That the NOAA, kind of here in DC, produces these Arctic sea ice report cards, which steadily show that the sea ice is retreating, and the environment is essentially undergoing what natural scientists call just a state change, and is kind of even as cooperation continues, is today's multilateralism sufficiently dimensioned to this changing landscape? I will leave it there. I look forward to comments and discussion and questions with all of you.
Well, thank you, Elana, for that comprehensive and multifaceted discussion of the different aspects of Russia's role. And also beyond Russia, what is the status, what is the reality of the governance coming to the Arctic region? I really like your framing, the offer that is not a dichotomy, and there are other angles that can look into the issue and inspire new research on this topic. So now, Marlene, maybe you share with us what do you think about this type of issues?
Thank you for your invitation. Yeah, we'll have 2 sets of remarks, and I will try to keep them short so we still have time for discussion after. One set of remarks on what is the question. The big question of this seminar today is, can we continue, or how can Arctic cooperation continue in such a deteriorated geopolitical environment, and a second set of remarks on Russia's Arctic policy. But first, I would like to really congratulate Elena on her book and invite you to look at it, because it's really a great study on the notion of power and how this power geometry is at play in the Arctic. So on the first element, on discussing how the Arctic can be kind of segregated or partitioned from world politics, I think it's a key question, and that's interesting to see the different perspective on it. If you look from the Russian side, my understanding of Russia's perception of that issue is that, yes, the Arctic can and should be partitioned from world politics, because Russian foreign policy is very good at dissociating issues, at being cooperative on some and more confrontational on other. I think for the US policy, which is much more kind of holistic, it's much more complicated to manage this kind of gap, because the US policy, since the Ukrainian crisis, has been more about freezing on several aspects the discussion with Russia, and therefore creating a kind of more rigid way of dealing with Russia. And I think it's really important to realize that I feel now Russia as being both an adversary, a competitor, and a partner. And it will be the three at the same time. And that's the new normal. And I think Russia is dealing with these three levels much better than we are, because Russia has the kind of more plastic definition of what power means. Because it's less powerful than the US, just it has less money, less military power, so it has to be more imaginative about what to do with what it less. And therefore that makes Russia much more innovative in managing all the different ways of showing power, and it can be adversary, competition, and partnership at the same time. And in a sense, and I really like your notion of cooperation in conflict, because remember just Cold War decades, we tend to forget them, but we were used to work with the Soviet Union in a conflictual environment and developed a lot of cooperation, and that was working well, and that was well framed. So, and I think here also for Russia, it's much easier to go back to this kind of Cold War cooperation in conflict management that it is for us. And so on Arctic issues, I feel Russia mostly on the kind of partnering side. It may have some competition. I don't think there is adversary relations in the Arctic per se. And as Elena said, Russia is also more kind of partnering in the Arctic for posture or prestige issue, also because it needs money and cooperation, because it cannot hope to develop what he would like to see the Arctic becoming without having it more open. And so where I see really the kind of spillover of the international politics into the Arctic, or the risk of, it's the fact that the Baltic region and the Barents Sea are very much connected. So if you put that on the side, the other Arctic issues are kind of not confrontational, or when they are well managed with well-established mechanisms that make things kind of smooth. But the Barents Sea connection with the Baltic Sea tensions make the situation, I think, more sensitive. You have, of course, difficult tension between Russia and the Baltic states, between EU and Russia around Kaliningrad. You have all this regular violation of airspace, ships and fighters and counters. And then that's the tension that we have now between globally NATO countries and Russia in the Baltic states is so close and with so many of the same actors that what is happening in the Barents Sea, that it's where I think that, in fact, all the kind of tensions or spillover could be there. And if you think there is a continuum between what is happening in Ukraine since 2014, the fact that Russia wants to bypass Ukrainian territory for reaching Europe in terms of energy and therefore building the Nord Stream 2 through the Baltic Sea, the tension it's creating with Scandinavian and Baltic countries, and the fact that just on the other side of this Baltic Sea, you have the Barents Sea with all its nuclear and conventional forces and its energy wells. So I think that's where there is a potential risk of spillover that should be looked at, but otherwise on many other aspects of Arctic issues, I think Russia is really on a kind of partnering strategy, or when it's less, then we have well-established mechanism to deal with potential tension, with one caveat that you mentioned, which is the distrust. the general distress atmosphere make that indeed in case of risk of accident or incident, we don't know if this kind of distressed general environment could aggravate the situation. My second set of remarks is on the Russia's Arctic policy, and what Elena also mentioned, which I think is really critical, is this kind of contradictory policy of being open and closed. And that makes our reading quite challenging, because Russia is sending mixed signals, and we have to deal with these mixed signals and interpret them and react to them. So yes, Russia is becoming much more visible in the Arctic since the last decade. At the same time, what does that mean? Much more active compared to what? And that's where I think we have a huge kind of misreading of misinterpretation of Russia when we try to compare that with the 90s and think that the 90s, the norms, we would like to go back. And we hope that the day Putin will leave, Russia will go back to this kind of 90s. But on the Russian perspective, the 90s is everything but normalcy. And Russia will never go back to this kind of 90s atmosphere, whoever is in power. The normalcy for Russia is the 80s. So if you think, is Russia really more active or more aggressive in the Arctic? Well, compared to what? Compared to the 90s? Yes, compared to the 80s, no. It's still quite low, at a quite low level of activities in terms of military presence in the Arctic that the Soviet Union was in the 80s. So that's the first element, is that both the West and Russia don't have the same definition of normalcy in terms of not the same comparative element that make us kind of feeling that Russia is maybe more active than we would like, while for Russia it's just feeling like it's just kind of trying to fill the gap of activities of the 90s. The second element, which is difficult to interpret for us, I think, is the relaunch of the military-industrial complex and everything that it means for the Arctic. And I think it's really important to realize that it's mostly domestic policy and domestic politics in Russia. You have powerful lobbies that needs to capture state budget and get this money to kind of bypass the fact that they don't have enough foreign direct investment, they don't have enough foreign technologies or foreign cooperation, and so the only way for them is really to kind of push to secure state order for the military industry and not let it die. So in a sense, what we tend to see as, Russia is kind of preparing for war, or by becoming more and more active on the military with its military-industrial complex, when you look on the Russian side, it's much more just kind of industrial policy of not letting all these big industries dying and the state having to put money and order to commission new projects because otherwise the industries would die. So that's also kind of make us sometimes having difficulties interpreting what is really happening in terms of Russia's military presence in the region. And then my last point is that Russia is a very dysfunctional state on many aspects, and it's a state which is difficult to make it work. And the territorial and infrastructure challenges that Russia has to deal with in the Arctic, they are just huge. And I think we tend to not really understand that because for us, Alaska is kind of far away and kind of dissociated from the rest of the territory. But the Russian perspective is really that the Arctic is not something exotic or far away. It's Siberia, and it's the Siberian landmass. And this landmass has like 10 million people, if we take the Arctic and subarctic region living there, and these people needs to be integrated to the mainland. So it's really mostly a territory and infrastructure management issue that Russia is dealing with in the Arctic, and in such kind of territorial and climatic condition, and with the fact that the Russian state is very dysfunctional on many aspects, the only functional and reliable administrative entity that can manage that are the army and the security services. And I think it's really important to realize that what for us would be civil security management is in Russia done by army and security services, which means that when we see new military bases with FSB people or ministry emergency troops, of course they can play a military function and can be activated as a military function if needed, but their main goal is just civil security. It's to just manage and have kind of functional, well-equipped, well-trained people able to kind of act rapidly if something happens. And so I think it's really important to see that Russia doesn't have other entities that can deal with this kind of territorial and infrastructure challenges than its power ministries. And in a sense, it's therefore legitimate for Russia to try to use what it has to secure its territory. But of course, for us, it means that we have to manage this kind of dual interpretation, or is that just internal management, Russia facing its own internal challenging and trying to manage it, or can this management be transformed or have a kind of dual function and become activated at the military threat? So that was my kind of two set of remarks on this kind of global discussion, and I will stop here.
Thank you, Marlene. That's really clear and sharp. To begin with, I think the takeaway is Russia has less money, less military power, therefore it has to be more imaginative rather than cooperative, and it is sending mixed signals, and it's also dysfunctional. So if I can ask both of you a question, just based on what you both just said, if you have to look into the next 5 to 10 years and look at Russia's Arctic policy, do you think it will stay in this pursuit of cooperation track, or is going to diverge from that a little bit, where it depends on what is going on internally in Russia and also between U.S. and Russia? What do you think?
That's an interesting question, Yoon. I think, I remember also, when I started looking at Russia's Arctic activities and policy making in the early 2000s, I remember it was quite the job. I had to kind of trace it up in local newspapers and in this and that statement from this and that place. But really, since about 2006, 2007, 2008, Russia has had a fairly consistent message about Arctic space that has lasted over the last 10 years. Now that can, and you're basically saying that, the Arctic it continues with a zone of peace framing, also that Russia wants to be able to defend its national interests in the Arctic. So again, here we have the imaginative plastic actor. It's both things, as many other Arctic states also declare. The protection of the environment and economic development is kind of the main, very complicated goals and aspirations. It's difficult to, think what exactly could change. Of course, an intensification of security, rivalry, or so on. But thus far, all of the Arctic states, while many of them have engaged in changes to adapt to a more open and changing Arctic environment, have avoided changes that would look like a militarization of Arctic problems. So lots of those scholars who look at Arctic military issues say, for example, that Russia's military is in the Arctic, but not necessarily about the Arctic. And it relates to also all of those kind of soft security issues. And many of the developments that we're seeing play out today were also budgeted for in a much rosier period of time of cooperation in 2010, 11, and 12. So thinking, what will it be different? I think part of it is also, I think probably maybe the biggest source of potential change in the Arctic is also, will the Arctic continue to have a lot of economic promise? So part of it also depends on, as we gear towards a more green economy, will those resources in the Arctic over the long term be worth as much? Or will there be other things that make the Arctic environment and this kind of peaceful Arctic environment valued, like deep sea mining and so on? So I didn't quite answer the question, but I think, Marlene, you want to.
No, I think all the Arctic states will try to stay on the cooperation line. I think very strongly until the last moment, but I think no one would push for the region becoming a place of conflict, and everybody will try to avoid spillover. I think it will mostly depend on the international situation globally and some possible spillover. I don't think domestic change can be so influential. If there will be strong, domestic change in Russia, they will probably not be reflected on the Arctic, but on the near abroad, the post-Soviet region, which is more important for Russia. So I think there is goodwill on all sides to try to avoid any kind of deterioration of the Arctic climate, but then you never know. Yeah.
If I can just jump add, I think also an important thing to keep in mind is that that the Arctic is also crisscrossed by these networks of non-state actors of varying. Some of them might be lower-level civil servants. Some of them might be policy networks or research networks of various stripes. But it's very important, I think, valuable to a cooperative atmosphere in the Arctic that we do have these policy networks that cut across country boundaries. Because even in light of that there will be probably political change in Russia at some point, but the likelihood of shifting out these policy networks is very low.
That's terrific. So with that, we have about 10, 15 minutes for discussion. There is a mic floating. So if you have any questions, please shoot.
I was wondering about the role of the indigenous people, the Sami, the Inuit, and so forth, and do they play any part in the councils and the governance?
Thank you. That's an important. Shall I just answer
Sure,
as we
please.
go? I think that's a very important question. I think that you cannot understand the growth of Arctic governance over these past decades without understanding the very important role that Indigenous peoples and their organizations have had in shaping Arctic governance. And I think some of the, like even if you go back to the example I gave during the talk of this first ministerial meeting in Iqaluit after in 2015, that that the fact that these Indigenous peoples representatives intervened very strongly, for example, the Sami organization, really highlighted that we have concerns that cut across the Nordic countries and Russia that we will not have jeopardized by interstate conflict. And also, if you go back to the early days of the Arctic Council, and I write about it a little in the book, and there's also a great book by Jessica Shadian that looks at how the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, bringing together the Inuit of Russia, Canada, Alaska, and Greenland, had a very important voice in bringing about the Arctic Council in the first place, in these forms of Arctic cooperation. I think, of course, a challenge for these representatives in trying to speak on behalf of these other peoples or other sovereignties in the Arctic is just that as Arctic politics and governance becomes increasingly complex, that there are just simply so many locations where important parts of Arctic governance are discussed that it's difficult for these small offices to maintain the same sort of voice. So also an important change you see in the Arctic Council in the last few years, and especially under the U.S. chairmanship, was an attempt to kind of consolidate and bring together, have all the Arctic Council working groups meet at the same time, very much on the notion of trying to make participation more meaningful and decision-making more meaningful. And that was also one of the concerns, for example, about China or many other new countries gaining observer status at the Arctic Council, was simply that it would be, how is the ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, supposed to weigh up against a country the size of China in terms of their diplomatic resources? So that's just an example. Some people might wish to supplement. Yeah.
Priscilla, please. Oh, there's a mic.
Thank you. I've got two little questions. The first one is the chart you showed on leadership in coordinating the Arctic Council. The largest group was the others. Can you give me an example of who they are? That's one question. The second one is, do you know anything about the status of U.S.-Russian negotiations on the Bering Strait border? It's probably the longest running border negotiation in the world.
Right.
Ooh, that's a small question.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to weigh in on it? I'll go first.
Yeah, go.
Okay, and also just to briefly extend on the Indigenous peoples, that Russia, there's also a Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North that actually represents a large number of different peoples that are across the Russian North, and they've had a very challenging, very difficult time with Russia authorities very much tightening up on funding that comes abroad for civil society and so on, and also just had a difficult time in being put under pressure in areas where they've tried to protest or tried to oppose a government position. But turning to the others, that does sound kind of like an ominous category, because it's missing all the text in the book, but it really is. That's mostly the work of the secretariats. So that many of the working groups, and also there is an Arctic Council Secretariat, although it doesn't run that many projects, but many of the working groups on various issues from preparedness in response to marine mammals have their own secretariat, and many of them run projects. And so that's also an important source of funding, because some of the secretariats tend to be funded by very few by one country or another. So like, Norway funds a lot of one secretariat that does research on natural science. No, and I think that part of the process towards kind of adjusting and adapting who could be an observer at the Arctic Council involved kind of creating a new set of rules around also who would sponsor and lead projects. And it still has the Arctic states and permanent participants, and the secretariats are the main actors there. And then the second question, and U.S.-Russia negotiations, that's not something I know that much about the status of that. I mean, as far as I've always understood it, it's simply kind of respected. The agreement is respected by both sides, but not ratified.
Yeah,
But it's interesting to see.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
The fisheries agreement seems to be quite respected on both sides. So that's this kind of, it's potentially a tension, but it's not in practice because the mechanism to make it manageable works well. But then there is no way the Russian Duma would ratify it, especially now in such a context. So it was already not possible before, and they will not do it now.
I mean, it's as bad as the U.S. Congress?
That will be for another discussion.
Yeah. That sounds like another seminar.
We'll have another seminar on that.
But it is interesting. I mean, it is interesting to see what happens there, because it is an interesting kind of point of connection between Russia and the U.S. And just recently, I believe in May, that Russia and the United States had cooperatively proposed some new voluntary navigational routes in the Bering Sea that were approved by the International Maritime Organization. But it is, I do remember also sitting in at Arctic Circle in 2000, at this big conference in Iceland in 2016, and it was the day that Obama first made a public declaration about that Russia had interfered in the Democratic National, in the party emails, and it was all representatives from Alaska saying, but we have this special issue, that these are our closest neighbors, and we have so many shared issues that we need to shine a light on the possibility for cooperation. So it's that stage in Arctic Circle was very different. Yeah. Yeah, well, that was probably, if she's living on Little Diomede Island, then she probably can. But
It's possible. Well, maybe one more question, if there is any. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. China has recently been showing their presence a lot more in the Arctic region and has recently announced their nuclear icebreaker to be deployed, which indicates that they'll have a long-term presence in the area. How do you think that this will shift the dynamics?
Do you mean the Snow Dragon 2?
Yes.
It's a diesel field. They're building nuclear ones.
Right,
but
they're building. It has not been deployed.
It has not been deployed, and but the Dragon 2 is Snow Dragon 2 is diesel fuel. Should I?
I think that sounds like a great question for you.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, China showing presence. We just published a report on this topic, discussing the intricacy of the Chinese calculation coming to their Arctic presence. I think the Chinese fundamentally face the problem of their identity as not an Arctic state. Like Elana just pointed out, there's Arctic states versus non-Arctic states. And that dichotomy has been pretty much deeply embedded in the narrative, in the discourse coming to the Arctic governance issue. So China came up with this term called near Arctic state, and it's actually in their government white paper. So it's claiming that although we're not an Arctic state, what happens in the Arctic have a direct relevance to what to China's national interest, and they have a very elaborate argument as for why that is the case. But in another direction, really demonstrate certain vulnerabilities when they perceive their potential role and their engagement in the Arctic. And there's quite a strong sense of resentment, might be too strong a word. There's a sense of grievance that the Arctic Council has been rejecting a bigger role or a deeper engagement from China. And the other issue that might worth noticing is that the Chinese approach so far is very much based on science diplomacy, using scientific cooperation as a door opener for China to gain their access and entry into the Arctic governance issue. And in the case specifically to Russia, which Logan also did some research on, specifically to Russia is through the Polar Silk Road that China announced late in 2017. So that's a very much infrastructure-oriented, economic-oriented approach, knowing that Russia lacks technology, financing infrastructure in those regions. And the Chinese have proposed a quite ambitious plan to build ports along the Northern Sea route. And it will be interesting to see, Marlene, how the Russia respond to that, because in 2013, 2014, there were incidents, were presidents of Russia denying Chinese ships or Chinese vessels access to the Northern Sea route. So whether that's going to be a sore spot between China and Russia, I think we will definitely see more on that.
Yeah, well, I think Russia has a room of maneuver that is much more limited now because of the Western sanction, and of course they have no other choice now than to be more welcoming toward Chinese investment in the Arctic, both on the sea and on the land. Even if so officially it's the full honeymoon between Russia and China, and you will never have a Russian official now being too critical about Chinese presence. But of course, the Russians are not stupid. They just have their room of maneuver is small, so they have to face what is happening right now, which is the West is the main issue and China is the partner. Even if they know that on the long term they have to be very careful on the way China could become too much of an issue for them in Siberia and in the Arctic. But for the moment, they have to play according to the rule that more or less China is deciding, because that's the only country ready to put money and big money in Russia's Arctic project.
Sure. Elana.
Well, I just, as we all know, honeymoon lasts forever. Because I do think, we made it from our own lives, that I think what's also very interesting is that for Russia's Arctic politics, that this emphasis on preference for working with the coastal states directly on Arctic politics has really been an important aspect of the past 2 decades, and a clear foreign policy preference. But it is interesting to think of how will this kind of reliance on Chinese capital and also the